It began with just a few words spoken carefully by Zohran Mamdani during prime time. But within hours, those words ignited a firestorm that left Sebastián Piñera raging, Congress scrambling, and millions of Americans asking the same question: who do you really trust? The television lights were blinding, but Zohran Mamdani looked calm. It was a Wednesday night in Washington, prime time, the kind of slot reserved for voices that the nation couldn't ignore. Across the country, millions tuned in, some by accident, flipping channels, others because they'd heard the buzz that Mamdani was going to say something unusual. What no one expected was how sharp, how direct, and how explosive his words would be. He leaned forward slightly, his hands folded, his voice steady, and then with that trademark pause before he delivered something serious, he said it. There are ongoing violations taking place in this government. They're not just embarrassing, they're dangerous, and they undermine the very foundation of democracy. This administration is not only failing the people, it is prioritizing corporate greed over the well-being of ordinary citizens. The studio audience which had been instructed to remain quiet, shifted in their seats. You could almost hear the air being sucked out of the room. The host's eyebrows shot up. This wasn't the cautious, measured Zohran Mamdani people had grown used to. This was something else. The camera zoomed tighter on his face. His tone was deliberate, almost lawyerly, as he listed the allegations. Secret financial entanglements with corporations tied to government contracts, the reckless management of national resources, and the suppression of labor rights. Each example landed like a hammer blow. Measured, not shouted, but somehow more devastating for that very reason. People deserve honesty, he continued, his gaze unwavering. The American people put trust in their leaders, and that trust is being broken right now in plain sight. In living rooms from Spokane to Tampa, families stopped what they were doing. Some muted their phones, others leaned closer to the TV. In a diner in Des Moines, the staff left plates cooling on the counter, craning their necks toward the mounted screen in the corner. The host, clearly aware that the moment was history in the making, tried to probe further. Mr. Mamdani, are you saying the sitting president is committing crimes while in office? Mamdani didn't flinch. He simply replied, I'm saying that we are witnessing a pattern of conduct that is both unethical and illegal, and the longer people stay silent, the deeper the damage will be. The audience, bound by the rules of the program, held back applause or gasps. But at home, that restraint didn't exist. Social media exploded in real time. Viewers scrambled to record their screens, uploading clips within seconds. By the time Mamdani finished his next sentence, hashtags were already climbing to the top of trending lists on X, Instagram, and TikTok. Within 5 minutes, commentators were cutting clips, overlaying them with bold headlines like Mamdani exposes Piñera and breaking allegations rock the White House. But what struck people most wasn't just the content, it was the delivery. Mamdani wasn't shouting. He wasn't waving papers in the air or pointing fingers. He was calm, precise, and deliberate. And that calmness made the weight of his words almost unbearable for the man in the Oval Office. The director's voice in the earpiece of the host reportedly cracked as he whispered, "We're making history right now." The host nodded slightly, then pressed further. "Why now? Why speak out today?" Mamdani leaned back, almost as if he had anticipated the question all week. Because silence is complicity. If those who know better say nothing, then the system rots. And I care too much about this country to let that happen. At that moment, you could feel a divide beginning to widen, not just between two men, but between two versions of America. One clinging to denial, the other daring to confront what it feared to see. And while Mamdani's words rang through televisions across the nation, another scene was already brewing inside the West Wing, one that would reveal just how explosive this confrontation was about to become. But the reaction outside that studio would prove even more shocking than the interview itself. By the time the interview wrapped, the shockwaves had already spread far beyond that Washington studio. Across the country, televisions in bars, dorm rooms, and living rooms replayed the same clip over and over. Mamdani leaning forward, his voice even, his accusations crisp. Viewers weren't just watching, they were dissecting every pause, every word, every glance. At a sports bar in Dallas, the game on the big screen had been forgotten. Plates of hot wings sat untouched as the room buzzed with conversation. "Did you hear that?" one man muttered, leaning over his drink. His friend shook his head slowly. "I never thought he'd go that far." Not on live TV. People huddled around phones, passing them across the table to replay the 30-second clip where Mamdani said, "illegal." The word alone was enough to set the room on edge. Meanwhile, in a dorm common room at Arizona State, students sprawled on couches watching the trending feed on TikTok. One girl with glasses scrolled furiously, then held her phone up to the group. He literally just accused him of breaking the law on live television. "Look, the hashtags are already at the top." The screen showed a flood of posts. # Mamdani bombshell, # Piñera, exposed live on air. Within minutes, millions of views piled up. Cable networks scrambled. CNN cut short a segment on international trade, pivoting to a panel of stunned analysts. Fox News switched quickly to defense, their commentators raising questions about Mamdani's motives. "This is political theater," one anchor insisted. But the strain in her voice betrayed the urgency. MSNBC ran a headline in bright red: "Mamdani, Piñera engaged in ongoing violations." But the most telling reactions weren't on television. They were in homes. In Dayton, Ohio, a retired school teacher named Charles Reynolds sat with his wife, their TV flickering in the corner of the living room. He rubbed his forehead, muttering, "You know, he never talks like that unless he knows something." His wife nodded slowly, silent but uneasy. She'd lived through Watergate as a teenager, and this moment carried a familiar weight. What did Mamdani just set in motion? The Washington Post broke a push alert, citing unnamed officials inside the Justice Department, confirming that questions about classified material handling had been circulating quietly for months. Suddenly, what had felt like a political jab looked more like a carefully timed grenade. On social media, the divide was raw. Supporters of Piñera flooded the platforms with accusations of betrayal and coup attempts. Supporters of Mamdani praised his bravery. Independent voices simply asked, "If Mamdani's telling the truth, what happens next?" The uncertainty was intoxicating, terrifying, and impossible to look away from. Inside a newsroom in Los Angeles, a producer slammed her headset down and muttered, "Every channel is on this. It's not a story anymore. It's the story." And the numbers backed her up. Overnight polls conducted by small firms showed that while Piñera's loyal base remained firm, independents were already showing cracks. Words like credibility and trust appeared in early commentary. Mamdani's measured tone had worked like a scalpel, slicing through years of political noise. In that first wave of fallout, people weren't yet sure if this was scandal, spectacle, or something far darker. But one thing was clear: America was glued to its screens. Everyone had an opinion, and no one was ready to let it go. But while the public tried to make sense of Mamdani's words, inside the Palacio de la Moneda, Piñera was preparing to strike back. By sunrise the next morning, the presidential palace was already on edge. The air inside felt heavy, aides moving quickly but speaking in hushed tones. Phones buzzed with notifications. Televisions in every office replayed the interview, and staffers avoided eye contact as they passed one another in the hall. Everyone knew Piñera had seen it. Everyone was waiting for the explosion. It came in the form of a post. At 6:12 a.m., Truth Social lit up with Piñera's first reaction. The words were written in all caps. "Mamdani is a fraud. This is a radical leftist hoax. He should be ashamed." Within seconds, screenshots of the post flooded other platforms. Commentators were quick to notice that the president had posted 4 times in less than 20 minutes, each message angrier than the last. But Piñera wasn't finished. By late morning, an emergency press briefing was announced. Reporters scrambled to make their way to the press room, the air thick with anticipation. The podium stood waiting, the crisp presidential seal gleaming in the light. The room was packed wall to wall with journalists. When Piñera entered, the shift was immediate. His face was flushed, his tie slightly crooked, his jaw tight. He didn't wait for questions. He went straight to attack mode. "Mamdani," he said, stabbing the air with his finger, "is a disgrace, a complete disgrace. What he did last night, like on national television, is the most disgusting thing I've ever seen. This is nothing more than a pathetic attempt to bring down your favorite president. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions all at once, the volume so high that the press secretary had to slam her hand on the podium to regain order. But Piñera leaned into the chaos. He thrived on it. You think Mamdani cares about the truth? He doesn't. He cares about himself. He's working with the corrupt media, with radical prosecutors, with the whole crooked system to stop me. But it won't work. We're stronger than ever. A CNN reporter shouted from the third row, "Mr. President, do you deny mishandling classified documents as he suggested?" Piñera glared. "I deny it. Totally deny it. There's nothing there. They've been after me for years, and every time, nothing. You know why? Because I've done nothing wrong." The tension was electric. Cameras zoomed in close, capturing every beat of sweat, every sharp movement of his hands. The contrast with Mamdani's calm, measured delivery the night before was impossible to ignore. While Mamdani spoke like a professor presenting evidence, Piñera raged like a man cornered. At one point, a journalist from Reuters tried to ask a follow-up. "But sir, Mamdani's credibility." Piñera cut him off mid-sentence. "Credibility? Credibility? Give me a break. The guy lied about my campaign. He's ruining the country, and now he wants to play hero. No, he's the problem. He's always been the problem." The briefing spiraled. What was supposed to be a 20-minute address dragged into nearly an hour of back-and-forth insults and denials. The president mocked Mamdani's tone, mocked the media, and mocked the weak politicians who dared question him. At one point, he pounded the podium so hard the microphones rattled. Inside the room, seasoned reporters exchanged glances. They'd seen anger before, but this was different. This was raw, unfiltered, uncontrolled. By the time Piñera stormed out, refusing to take further questions, the coverage was already writing itself. Networks cut the briefing into highlight reels, one headline after another flashing across the screen. Piñera explodes after Mamdani's allegations. President denies wrongdoing. Attacks Mamdani. Meanwhile, across the country, Chileans tuned in and compared. Mamdani's calm versus Piñera's fury. Mamdani's precision versus Piñera's rage. For some, it was confirmation of what they already believed. For others, it was the first time doubt began to creep in, and in polling offices, phones started ringing. Early data was showing what would soon become clear. Independents weren't impressed. The anger didn't reassure them, it rattled them. But the most damaging blow wasn't the briefing itself. It was how the two men now looked side by side on every screen in Chile. By mid-afternoon, the entire country was watching what some anchors were calling the split-screen presidency. Every major network had footage queued up, toggling between Mamdani's composed interview from the night before and Piñera's heated press conference that morning. The images spoke louder than any commentary could. On one side of the screen, Mamdani seated, shoulders relaxed, voice calm, his words sharp but steady. On the other, Piñera standing at the podium, face flushed, hands cutting through the air, his tone rapid and uneven. Producers didn't need to edit the contrast. It was already built into the story. Cable news hosts leaned back in their chairs and said what millions of viewers were thinking. This is less about what was said and more about how it was said. Or maybe that's what fighting looks like. He's not going to sit there and take it. But even as he said it, his eyes stayed fixed on the screen, uneasy. Pollsters and strategists picked up on these conversations immediately. Focus groups in swing states revealed a consistent theme. Mamdani came across as credible, Piñera as chaotic. In suburban Santiago, a woman told a pollster, "I didn't vote for Mamdani, but I trust him more than I trust what I saw from Piñera today." In Valparaiso, a man confessed, "I like Piñera's economic policies, but I don't like seeing him that out of control." Inside newsrooms, producers worked overtime splicing together montages. MSNBC played a split-screen reel that went viral. Mamdani's calm line, "People deserve honesty," immediately followed by Piñera shouting, "Mamdani is a disgrace." The juxtaposition was brutal. CNN analysts described it as a masterclass in contrasts. Even conservative commentators admitted privately to reporters that the optics were a nightmare. The difference bled into comedy too. Late-night hosts pounced, playing the clips back-to-back, pausing after Mamdani's careful delivery to let the silence breathe before cutting to Piñera's furious rant. The audience roared. Hashtags like #Mamdani v. Piñera and #split screen Chile trended through the evening, and then came the polls. Within 24 hours of Mamdani's interview, a flash survey showed a sudden 7-point swing among independents. Trust in Mamdani's word sat at 62%, while Piñera's denial barely reached 34%. Headlines blared the numbers across websites, feeding the narrative that this was more than a feud. It was a credibility test. Inside the Palacio de la Moneda, staffers scrambled. One aide told Politico off the record, "It's not just what he said, it's how it looks. We're losing the optics battle." Another reportedly added, "Every time the networks run the clips side by side, we fall further behind." Mamdani, meanwhile, kept quiet. He didn't post, didn't tweet, didn't give a follow-up interview. That silence, deliberate and disciplined, made the contrast even starker. While Piñera flooded the internet with angry posts, Mamdani simply let the words from his interview stand on their own, as though he knew the replay would do the work for him. In living rooms across Chile, people kept comparing. A mother in La Serena, watching with her teenage daughter, said softly, "One looks like a leader, the other looks like he's panicking." Her daughter, eyes glued to the screen, replied, "Even I can see that, and I don't even care about politics." The split screen wasn't just a television trick, it had become a cultural shorthand, a way of showing the nation the choice it was facing. Composure versus chaos, facts versus fury, steadiness versus storm. But behind the scenes in Santiago, the real panic wasn't on television. It was inside the walls of the presidential palace itself. Piñera's office had survived countless scandals, but this one felt different. Staffers described the air inside the Palacio as combustible, the kind of tension where everyone walked a little faster, spoke a little quieter, and avoided being the one caught in the president's line of sight. The fallout from Mamdani's interview wasn't just out there in the media, it was rattling the walls from within. In the Roosevelt Room, senior advisors huddled around a long oak table. Coffee cups stood half-finished, papers scattered with polling numbers. TV screens mounted on the wall showing non-stop coverage of the split-screen contrast. Kellyanne, arms folded, stared down at her notes while Stephen paced the floor. "He's losing the optics war," Stephen muttered. "Every channel is running that damn side-by-side. It's killing us," Kellyanne shot back, then changed the narrative. "Attack the source, attack the motive. People don't care about calm and collected. They care about loyalty." The room fell silent when the door slammed open. Piñera stormed in, his tie slightly loosened, his face still flushed from the press briefing. He pointed at the TV on the wall where Mamdani's calm face stared back. "Turn that off! Turn it off!" he barked. An aide rushed to grab the remote. Piñera dropped into the chair at the head of the table, slamming his palm against the wood. "We're not gonna sit here and let that guy lecture us. He's a failure. He's jealous. He's working with the deep state, and you all know it." Stephen cleared his throat cautiously. "Mr. President, with all respect, the anger, it's not landing well outside your base. Independence. Independents don't win elections. Loyalty does." Piñera snapped, cutting him off. "Mamdani's lying. Everyone knows it. Our people need to hear me say it loud again and again." From the corner, a younger aide raised a tentative voice. "Sir, maybe if we provide documentation, something to refute what he said." Piñera's eyes narrowed. "Documentation? We don't need documentation. We need to fight. Fight him. Fight the press. Fight the whole crooked system. You think anyone cares about papers? They care about strength." The tension in the room thickened. Kellyanne leaned forward, lowering her voice so only those closest could hear. "We need to calm this down before it snowballs. Right now, he looks like the steady hand. You look like the storm." Piñera shot her a glare. "And what do you suggest? Sit there like a statue. People don't want statues, they want fighters." He jabbed his finger at the table. "I'm not going to play Mamdani's game. He thinks he's clever. Watch me. I'll tear him apart." A silence lingered. No one dared contradict him further. They all knew his mind was set. Meanwhile, outside that room, whispers were spreading. Junior staffers clustered in hallways, peeking at headlines on their phones. "Did you see the numbers?" one asked another nervously. 7 points among independents overnight. A communications aide muttered back, "If this keeps up another week, we're toast." Inside the press office, frantic calls went out to sympathetic media outlets, urging them to question Mamdani's credibility, to frame his comments as politically motivated. Draft talking points were scribbled, rewritten, and distributed within hours. The instructions were blunt: hit hard, stay on message, never acknowledge the specifics. But the staff could feel the shift. The fury coming from the Palacio wasn't strategy, it was raw emotion. And raw emotion wasn't always controllable. One aide confided to a reporter later, "It was like trying to put a lid on boiling water. You knew it was going to spill over. It was just a question of when." As the sun set over Santiago, the Palacio looked outwardly calm, its windows glowing in the night. But inside, the mood was volatile, the walls echoing with the sound of raised voices, hurried footsteps, and phones ringing nonstop. Every advisor knew the truth. This wasn't a one-day story. Mamdani had thrown a stone into the pond, and the ripples were spreading faster than anyone could contain. But outside those guarded walls, the media was about to turn the pressure dial even higher. By Thursday morning, the news cycle had fully detonated. Networks no longer needed to build new packages. The footage of Mamdani and Piñera played on loop, filling every broadcast, every feed, every podcast. Producers joked that they could run the same 30-second clip all day, and people would still tune in. And in many places, that's exactly what was happening. On CNN, anchors gathered in front of a wall of screens displaying quotes side by side. "People deserve honesty," versus "Mamdani is a disgrace." The visual alone was damning. Over at Fox, the tone was defensive. Hosts tried to redirect attention, suggesting that Mamdani's timing was suspicious and meant to distract from real issues. Yet even in their denial, they couldn't escape playing the clip. Podcasters jumped in quickly. A popular political show recorded an emergency episode overnight, uploading it before dawn. "This isn't about partisan lines anymore," the host said, his voice low and urgent. "This is about one man looking like a statesman and the other looking like he's unraveling before our eyes." The episode shot to the top of Spotify charts within hours. Late-night hosts were merciless. One aired a skit where an actor imitating Mamdani calmly read from a grocery list, while another dressed as Piñera screamed accusations about bread being rigged. The audience howled. Comedy cut through the tension, but it also amplified the narrative. Calm versus chaos. Meanwhile, reporters were digging. Mamdani had mentioned financial entanglements in classified materials, but hadn't provided details. That vacuum of information was irresistible to journalists. By midday, Politico published a story citing unnamed officials, claiming that a classified folder had indeed been mishandled months earlier, raising eyebrows inside the Pentagon. The New York Times followed with a piece highlighting ongoing concerns about conflicts of interest tied to foreign properties. Neither article directly accused Piñera of crimes, but together they gave Mamdani's claims an aura of legitimacy. In Philadelphia, a newsroom was buzzing. Phones rang off the hook as editors pushed their reporters to call every source they had in government agencies. "We need confirmation, anything, even a whisper," one editor barked. A junior reporter, headphones pressed tight, "I've got something," before rushing to type up notes. Back in Los Angeles, the entertainment industry latched onto the spectacle. Influencers on Instagram stitched together montages of Mamdani's quotes set to dramatic music, pulling millions of views. TikTok teens filmed reaction videos of themselves nodding solemnly during Mamdani's segment and then mimicking Piñera's rage with exaggerated gestures. Satirical, yes, but devastating in how easily the contrast spread to younger audiences. Across middle Chile, families watched the coverage while juggling daily routines. In Antofagasta, a mechanic wiped grease from his hands, staring at the television in his garage waiting room. "I voted for him," he admitted to a waiting customer. "But man, he looks like he's cracking." The customer, a woman in her 60s, responded, "Mamdani's too smart to say that without proof. Mark my words, there's more coming." The frenzy wasn't just media-driven, it was feeding on itself. Every outlet feared being left behind, so speculation filled the air. Was Mamdani tipped off by prosecutors? Did he know about an investigation the public didn't? Pundits argued, spun theories, drew connections. Each hour produced new talking points, new rumors, new questions. Piñera's allies were dispatched to television studios across the country, armed with the same tight script. Mamdani was bitter. Mamdani was political. Mamdani was desperate for relevance. But the repetition only highlighted the weakness of the defense. If that's all they've got, one MSNBC analyst said, they're already on the back foot. International coverage added another layer. The BBC framed it as an extraordinary clash between past and present presidents. In France, Le Monde described it as a televised trial without a courtroom. Foreign leaders didn't comment publicly, but diplomats privately told journalists that the spectacle was embarrassing for the office of the presidency. By evening, the cycle had grown so relentless that viewers almost forgot less than 48 hours had passed. It felt longer. Every Chilean with a smartphone had seen the clip at least a dozen times, many already memorizing Mamdani's exact phrasing. And yet, amid all the noise, one question kept surfacing. If Mamdani was this specific on air, what else did he know behind the scenes? But while journalists and commentators debated the substance, ordinary Chileans were having conversations of their own, and those conversations were starting to tilt the balance. By Friday morning, the frenzy had spilled out of the studios and newsrooms and into the daily conversations of ordinary Chilean citizens. The story wasn't just something people consumed on television. It was what they talked about at kitchen tables, in barbershops, in waiting rooms, and at workplaces across the country. Every voice added a new layer, a new interpretation of what had happened. At a diner in Santiago, the breakfast rush slowed as customers leaned toward the television mounted above the counter. The screen replayed Mamdani's calm words while the room buzzed with debate. "He looked like he meant it," said a man in overalls, stirring his coffee without drinking it. Across from him, a woman shook her head. "I don't care what he says. Piñera's fighting for us. Mamdani's just trying to tear him down." The waitress, sliding plates of eggs onto the table, chimed in, "But fighting for us doesn't mean screaming at reporters. Leaders don't lose their cool like that." In Concepcion, inside a barbershop filled with the hum of clippers, men argued between cuts. "You see Mamdani last night?" one barber asked, turning down the volume on the radio to make sure he was heard. "Came off like a preacher. He dropped those words like bricks." A customer in the chair laughed. "Preacher? More like lawyer. And Piñera? Man, he sounded guilty just by how he acted." Another man sitting on the couch disagreed. "That's his style. He's a fighter. You'd rather have someone quiet while they lie to you?" The room erupted in overlapping voices, everyone convinced the other side was missing the point. Meanwhile, in Valdivia, a group of veterans gathered at their VFW hall, sat in front of the TV, beers in hand. A retired Marine named Frank spoke first, his voice low but firm. "I've been around long enough to know composure when I see it. Mamdani didn't come across as guessing. He knows something." Another veteran, older, shook his head. "Doesn't matter. Even if it's true, what's anyone going to do about it? Presidents get away with everything." The room fell quiet for a moment before a third man added, "Not forever. Not if the people finally say enough." Families across Chile and the Andes were having the same kinds of conversations. In a suburb of Santiago, a mother driving her kids to school turned the car radio up as talk show hosts dissected the events. From the back seat, her teenage son asked, "Why is everyone freaking out? Can't they just prove it one way or another?" She sighed. "Because proving takes time. But right now, everyone's just watching how they act. And honestly, Mamdani looks steady. Piñera doesn't." Her daughter added, "Even kids at school are talking about it. Half the class showed the video during lunch." The generational divide was striking. Younger Chileans glued to TikTok were shaping the narrative with memes and quick cuts. They mocked Piñera's shouting while layering Mamdani's words over dramatic music. For them, the comparison was entertainment as much as politics. But for older Chileans, it felt like history repeating itself. In Valparaiso, a retired steelworker compared the moment to Pinochet's era. "I remember when people started doubting him, not because of the proof at first, but because he looked desperate. Same thing happening now." Religious communities also weighed in. At a church in Santiago after Sunday service, parishioners gathered in the fellowship hall discussing the week's events over coffee and empanadas. A pastor, choosing his words carefully, said, "Truth has a way of standing still while lies run themselves ragged. That's what you saw this week. Calm truth against frantic lies." Several nodded in agreement, though a few muttered skepticism under their breath. Even workplaces weren't immune. In a small bond manufacturing plant in Santiago, the lunch break turned into a heated argument. "Mamdani's out of line," one worker insisted. "He shouldn't attack the sitting president." A co-worker across the table shot back, "Yeah, but he's the only one who's got the guts to say it out loud. If it's true, we need to hear it." The room split down the middle, but everyone agreed on one thing. The story wasn't going away. Pollsters noted how quickly these conversations were shaping attitudes. In focus groups, phrases kept repeating. "He seemed guilty. Mamdani looked credible. It just doesn't sit right." Small shifts, subtle but significant, were taking root in households that once ignored political noise. By the end of the week, one thing was undeniable. The debate was no longer confined to politicians and pundits. It belonged to the public now. Ordinary Chileans wrestling with the same question: who do you trust? When the truth feels buried under anger and noise. But while the people were debating, lawmakers in Santiago were beginning to feel the heat, and some were no longer willing to stay silent. By Monday morning, the storm that had started with one interview had spilled onto Capitol Hill. Lawmakers could no longer dodge the microphones waiting outside their offices. Reporters crowded the hallways, cameras rolling as senators and representatives walked briskly toward votes, their every word dissected in real time. The questions were relentless. Do you believe Mamdani? Should the president respond with evidence? Is there truth to the allegations? In the Senate cafeteria, conversations that usually centered on policy or committee work were replaced by speculation. One Democratic senator from Concepcion muttered to a colleague, "He cuts straight to the bone. The more Piñera yells, the worse he looks." A Republican senator overhearing snapped back, "This is all theater. Mamdani wants to stay relevant, that's all." But even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. On the House side, staffers whispered in elevators. A young aide for a Midwestern representative told another, "Our phones won't stop ringing. Constituents are asking if their congressman believes Mamdani." The other aide's side, ours too. Half want him to defend Piñera, half want him to demand an investigation. We can't win either way. Cable news caught wind of the pressure almost instantly. MSNBC ran a segment highlighting which Republicans were ducking questions, replaying footage of one congressman from Valdivia ducking into a stairwell to avoid cameras. CNN aired a clip of a moderate Republican from Punta Arenas who cautiously said, "If the former president is raising concerns, they should be addressed seriously." That one line sent shockwaves through Santiago. It was the first crack in the wall of defense. By the afternoon, a small group of House Democrats held a press conference on the Capitol steps. Their leader, Representative Carmen Soto of New Mexico, spoke clearly into the microphones. The Chilean people deserve transparency. If there is evidence of misconduct, it must be examined. President Mamdani has raised concerns that cannot simply be brushed aside with insults. Reporters shouted follow-ups, but Soto's words had already landed. The call for accountability was out in the open. Inside the Palacio de la Moneda, aides scrambled as these clips played on repeat. "They're circling," one senior advisor muttered, pacing the Palacio. "If moderates start peeling off, this thing gets real." Even Piñera's allies in Congress faced tricky terrain. Senator Rick Dalton of Oregon went on Fox to defend him, declaring, "This is nothing more than political theater. President Piñera has done nothing wrong." But within minutes, his appearance was clipped and dissected online with side-by-side comparisons of Dalton's defense against polling data showing declining trust in the president. The defense looked hollow, rehearsed. Meanwhile, international voices added fuel. Germany's Der Spiegel published an editorial comparing Mamdani's calm to Merkel's during her toughest political storms. In London, The Guardian framed Piñera's outburst as the behavior of a cornered leader. These headlines circulated back into Chile, amplifying the perception of chaos at the top. The tension reached a boiling point at a committee hearing on unrelated legislation. During a break, reporters swarmed a Republican congresswoman from Valdivia. When pressed about the allegations, she paused, eyes darting to the cameras, then sighed. "Look, I respect President Mamdani. If he says there are violations, then it's worth looking into, but I'll withhold judgment until we see facts. Her words rippled across Twitter within seconds. A prominent journalist tweeted, "The dam is cracking." Public pressure continued to grow. Town halls over the weekend turned combative. In Santiago, a man stood up and demanded his representative stop making excuses and start asking questions. In rural Mali, a Republican lawmaker faced boos after dismissing Mamdani's comments as nonsense. Voters weren't just watching, they were demanding accountability. Back in Santiago, whispers about special committees and subpoenas floated through closed-door meetings. The more Piñera raged, the more lawmakers felt they had to distance themselves, if only to protect their own reputations. And yet, Mamdani remained silent. He hadn't posted a statement, hadn't given another interview. The quietness made lawmakers nervous. What did he know? Why had he chosen that moment to speak? And what was he holding back? The capital was restless. Allies grew anxious. Critics sharpened their knives. And the Chilean public waited. The story had started as one man's words, but now it was morphing into a test for the entire political system. But the real escalation came when proof, tangible and undeniable, suddenly entered the picture. It was Tuesday afternoon when the story broke wide open. For days, the media had been circling Mamdani's words, speculating, analyzing, and guessing at what evidence might exist. But speculation turned to reality when a leaked document landed in the inbox of multiple major news outlets at the same time. The source was anonymous, but the contents were explosive. A Department of Defense memo outlining concerns that classified material had been transported to one of Piñera's private properties without proper authorization. The memo was dated months earlier, stamped with internal clearance markings, and written in language that was cautious but clear. The handling of documents presents a potential risk to national security. Procedures were not followed. Within minutes, CNN ran a breaking news banner. MSNBC went live with the document on screen. Even Fox, though hesitant, reported it. The public reaction was instant. Across social media, screenshots of the memo spread like wildfire. The hashtag had the memo trending globally. Commentators who had dismissed Mamdani's claims just days before now found themselves recalibrating in real time. This lines up almost exactly with what he said, one analyst admitted on air. He wasn't speaking loosely. He knew this was out there. In Phoenix, a high school civics class erupted into chatter as their teacher projected the memo onto the smartboard. Students pointed out the lines that matched Mamdani's accusations. One student muttered, "So he was right all along." In a Detroit auto shop, mechanics paused their work, huddled around a phone. "It's not just politics anymore," one said. "See, this is national security." Inside the Palacio de la Moneda, chaos erupted. Phones rang non-stop. Advisors rushing between offices, staffers demanding to know how the document had leaked. Piñera's legal team scrambled to craft a response. Within an hour, the president himself appeared on Truth Social. "Fake document, total witch hunt. They made this up. Nothing to do with me." But the denial lacked force. Reporters quickly pointed out that the memo bore the signatures of career officials who had served under multiple administrations. On CNN, a retired Pentagon official confirmed the memo's authenticity, saying, "This is not fabricated. I've seen hundreds like it. This is standard internal communication." By evening, Piñera held another impromptu press conference. His anger was visible, his voice louder than usual, his gestures more erratic. "This is a disgrace," he shouted. "Mamdani is behind this leak. He's working with the fake news media to destroy your president. They can't beat us fairly, so they lie. This memo means nothing." Nothing. But reporters weren't backing down. One asked, "Sir, if it's fake, why does it carry real clearance markings?" Another followed, "If the memo is authentic, does it confirm what President Mamdani said?" Piñera grew redder with each question, finally storming off without answering. The room buzzed with shouted follow-ups as he disappeared behind the door. The contrast grew sharper by the hour. Mamdani remained silent, letting the memo speak for itself. Analysts replayed his calm words. Classified material mishandled beside the memo's warning. Procedures were not followed. The alignment was too perfect to ignore. Internationally, the coverage intensified. In Canada, CBC reported the memo as potentially the most serious breach of national security in years. In Germany, Der Tagesspiegel wrote that Mamdani's credibility had been vindicated. The world was watching, and Chile's internal storm had become global news. In small towns and big cities alike, the conversation shifted. A farmer in Iowa told a local reporter, "I voted for Piñera, but this, if it's true, I can't defend it." In San Diego, a group of Navy veterans gathered at a bar agreed unanimously. "The memo was damning. That's not politics," one said. "That's procedure. You break it, you put the country at risk." Congress responded quickly. By Wednesday morning, several moderate Republicans called for a formal inquiry. Democrats pushed harder, demanding hearings. The Speaker of the House, under intense pressure, promised to review the matter with urgency. The once political clash had now become a question of law. The breaking point wasn't just the memo itself, it was the undeniable reality that Mamdani's words had been backed by evidence. The man who had been accused of lying now looked prescient, while the man who screamed hoax looked cornered. But the story didn't end with the leak. The real test was what Chile would choose to learn from it and how it would judge the two men who defined the moment. The days after the leak felt like the closing act of a play that the whole world had been forced to watch. Television screens were filled with side-by-side images, Mamdani's interview calm and measured, and Piñera's furious denials at the podium. For many Chileans, the contrast was no longer just a political story. It had become a study in character. Families across Chile were still talking. In a living room in Santiago, a grandfather sat with his teenage grandson, watching the evening news. The old man leaned back in his chair, pointing at the screen. "That's what leadership looks like," he said, nodding toward Mamdani. "Not the yelling, not the tantrums, just steady words that end up being true." His grandson frowned. "But does that mean Piñera's finished?" The grandfather sighed. "Leaders don't last forever, but history remembers the ones who tell the truth." In Santiago suburbs, a group of neighbors gathered on a porch debated late into the night. One woman, a lifelong Piñera supporter, shook her head in frustration. "I defended him for years, but I can't defend that memo, and I can't defend that press conference. I want strength, but I don't want chaos." Another replied softly, "Sometimes calm is the real strength." The lesson wasn't lost on lawmakers either. Hearings were announced, subpoenas issued, and the once fringe calls for accountability suddenly looked inevitable. But the bigger shift wasn't in the halls of Congress. It was in the way ordinary Chileans now measured their leaders. For weeks, people had argued about policy, about partisanship, about what to believe. But in the end, it came down to trust. Mamdani had spoken carefully, deliberately, and backed by evidence that later surfaced. Piñera had responded with anger, volume, and denial. One analyst on PBS summarized, "What we've seen is a living example of two different kinds of power, the power of composure and the power of rage, and only one of those holds up when the facts catch up." The moral of the story resonated even beyond politics. Teachers used it in classrooms to illustrate the value of patience over impulse. Pastors used it in sermons to remind congregations that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. Even in households where opinions remained divided, parents told their kids, "This is why you think before you speak. This is why you stay calm when you're under pressure." In the end, Mamdani didn't need to give another interview. His silence was louder than any speech. Piñera, on the other hand, continued to rage online and on camera, but the more he spoke, the less convincing he sounded. The narrative had been written not just by words, but by behavior. History has a way of remembering moments, not just for what was said, but for how people felt when they witnessed them. And in this moment, millions felt that calm truth had finally outweighed furious denial. The story carried a simple but powerful lesson. In life as in leadership, composure often speaks louder than rage. When the pressure mounts, when accusations fly, when the world is watching, the person who stays steady commands the room. Anger may grab attention for a moment, but truth and calm endurance are what last. And that's the takeaway worth holding on to, not just for politics, but for anyone navigating conflict, doubt, or fear. The louder voice isn't always the honest one. The calm voice isn't always the weak one. And in the long run, it's integrity, not volume, that decides how history remembers you. So if you follow this story to the end, let it leave you with this. Trust is fragile, character is priceless, and truth when spoken quietly can move an entire nation. Make sure you subscribe because these aren't just stories about politics. They're lessons about life, leadership, and what it means to stay true when the spotlight burns brightest.